All right. Okay.
All right. Welcome, everybody. So, what we're going to do in this particular elective, we're going to talk about effective approaches to economic motions. It's going to take about the next 40 minutes or so, maybe even 45 minutes, to talk about some different approaches, some problems that often arise with economic motions, why those problems arise, how to address them. Largely, this is going to be informational with regards to how to approach them. There's not going to be really any specialized economic knowledge or anything. We might talk a little bit broadly about things like supply and demand, but ultimately not much of that. What I'm going to do is leave it to you all to really seek that out, to go out and find the information and the knowledge that you would need in order to succeed in a debate. So, So, that's pretty much the idea here, in that we're going to really focus on some of the problems that we face with regards to economic motions, some of the issues that arise, and then even when those issues arise, how to do a better job of approaching an economic motion so you're not the people who are making it bad. Because oftentimes, I'm sure some of you, actually by show of hands, how many people here do in fact study economics or have a background? A couple, right? Okay, so a few. And you probably know, if you've been in a debate about economics, that they usually go poorly. They're usually bad. Other people never know what they're talking about. They just say things and they pretend that it's important or that it is in fact correct. And the judge also doesn't know anything. And so then they're like, well, yeah, we bought that. That was really smart. And they're like, no, that's wrong. And you know that's wrong. And it upsets you a little bit, I would imagine. And that's why. Because I also studied economics. And this was a problem for almost every single economics program I've ever taken. And so that's why we're going to deal with some actual effective approaches to it. So let's get started. The structure about what we're going to talk about is we're first going to address some unique difficulties of economic motions, particularly how and why they are so difficult to approach, why that approach is true, and how we can do things to address them. Then we're going to look at some actual examples of economic motions and really focus in on what they look like and what are similar and different about them. Then we're going to look at some strategic argumentative approaches, and then finally we're going to look towards an extra step. An extra step of turning impacts into values. And that'll be the ultimate solution to addressing some of the big problems with economic motions. That we will turn impacts into actual values, or turn economic impacts into values. So, let's start looking at some of the unique difficulties of economic motions. I'm sure that some of you can imagine a few of them, of course, at any debate that you've been in. But we're going to look first at the field of economics and what they really focus in on. Because the field of economics tends to operate on this very stringent cost-benefit analysis. It's usually not interested necessarily in actual academic research. It's sometimes not very interested in qualitative questions, right? They're not really interested in, not qualitative, but rather normative questions. They're not interested in saying what is good or what is bad or what should or shouldn't be done, except with regard to what costs the least and has the largest benefit. Here, we're really talking about a cost-benefit analysis. So when people discuss the economy, especially in a debate, they also operate under this idea, under this framework of cost and benefit analysis. Now that's not always a bad thing, but the idea, of course, is that if cost is greater than benefit, then we ought to produce that product. So anytime that they're saying, economy versus environment debate, the economic stuff is usually things like, well, we should produce produce these goods because it doesn't cost that much to do so. And then the environmental side has to address it. They have to say things like, well, yeah, part of the reason that it doesn't cost so much to do this is because we don't count pollution as a cost, even though it very clearly costs us something. It costs us the quality of air. It costs us clear skies all the time. Those are costs that aren't included in the price. And that's what you're ultimately talking about with regards to a cost-benefit analysis. But in debate in particular, the framework of economics is oftentimes assumed to be the same framework. So the discipline of economics and economics debates are assumed to have the same framework. So you only evaluate it within the confines of, well, this will cost more, so that's bad, we shouldn't do it. Or the benefit is really good as compared to the cost. The benefit is great as compared to the cost, so we should do it. And then that's a boring debate. It doesn't go anywhere. Nobody knows what to say next. And so that assumption is very important, because it's that assumption that you can both address and fix and make better the next time you're in an actual economic debate. Because you can, number one, talk about the assumption if it helps your side. You can justify that framework for the debate. That's what's often missing. That step is often what's missing. The justification for that framework. Because, again, what we're saying here is that on one side of this debate, they say the cost is less than the benefit, so therefore we should do this thing. But then the other side has to say things that don't relate to that. They have to say things like, well, but we should just value the environment more than we do. And that's what they suffer from. There's a lack of engagement between each side, because one side, oftentimes let's say it's the government side, is operating on an assumed framework of cost-benefit analysis, and that being the right framework for the debate. Whereas the other side isn't saying or isn't talking about that framework. They're not addressing it in any way to say that it's wrong or it's incorrect, or that there are other ways that we should be doing it. But they also never justify their framework. They never justify why some things are just inherently valuable. They never say something like, we should just value the environment because we think it looks good. Because things that look good should make people happy, and that's a good thing. And we should do that. That's never justified in any way. And so what ends up happening in many motions about tangentially related to the economy ends up suffering from this lack of engagement, where both sides aren't actually talking about what the other side is talking about. So an example, of course, is this House would significantly tax tobacco. The proposition here talks about economics, right? They say things like, well, if we tax it more, people will have it less, and because people have it less, we will now have more tax revenue, and because we have more tax revenue, the government can do good things, therefore we should do this. But then opposition says, well, people should choose whether or not they want to have cigarettes. They should choose whether or not they want to have tobacco. And taxing it is very unfair. The result is that the judge has no idea what to do. Not that they have no idea, but they're in fact less certain about what was important. Because on one side, you have someone saying, okay, because it will cost more, and that will create less smokers, we should therefore do this policy. That's very different than saying on the other side, but people, regardless of the cost, have a right to choose whether or not they want to smoke. The two assumptions on each side there never get spoken about. They never get talked about or justified. And that ends up having a debate that runs in parallel lines right down each side. There are parallel lines where nobody talks about what the other side is saying. Nobody challenges the fact that just because it costs more, because you've taxed it more, because you've said that's a bad behavior, that's a good thing. That never gets addressed. In the same way, with the other side, just your proposition in this particular example, just says over and over again, but no, we're just taxing it. We're just going to say we're just taxing it. It will just cost a little bit more. That's fine. That's good. And because because of that lack of engagement, it makes it far more difficult, and in fact, borderline impossible, to have an effective economic debate. That's what we're going to correct. That's what we're going to try and address in a far clearer way. I'll give you an example, actually, again, that I didn't have the time because I wrote this a week ago. The show debate that we all did is a very good example, actually, of a debate that functions along these same lines, and that proposition has the opportunity to basically just say, we'll make good things happen. Basically saying that, it's difficult to read, isn't it? It's hard to read. Yeah. Not much to be done. Apparently the director is very old. This was a problem in the last lecture as well. However, in the show debate, it was similarly the case that proposition just got to say, here's a good policy that we'll do because it'll be nice and it'll be great. And then the opposition had to say things like, well, but no, that's not good, or no, it's not the best thing, because there are these other practical difficulties with what you're talking about. Like, you don't get, so government got to say that they'll make some lives better, and therefore it's good enough to do that policy. And then opposition had to say, even if you do, or even if you make some lives better, that's still not a good reason to do the policy. But actually what happened is that, I was in the opposition, I in fact remember what happened. It's that we had to, we got up and we said things like, you don't make the lives of those people better, and that's not good enough. And then they just got to say, we make some, like, even if we make 2 or 3 lives better, it's fine, that's good, and that's a policy that we want to do. Instead, we should be discussing the frameworks that we were assuming were going to be important in the debate round. We should have said something like, government policies that don't affect or don't have a positive impact on a majority of people shouldn't be implemented. That's what we should have been talking about, but we didn't talk about that. We didn't talk about those frameworks. Not until far later in the debate did anyone actually kind of even begin to address that. Okay? So that's another example about when assumptions within the debate round end up resulting in very parallel argumentation without much engagement in it. Because ultimately, if we think that on opposition, that there has to be a majority of people affected positively by government policy, they're going to say something different. They're going to say any government policy that significantly improves the lives of even a few people is a worthwhile government policy. Then we're having a debate. Then there's engagement. And then the differences between what we're saying are so much clearer. And that's the goal. That's what we want to do. And so, now that we know some of the unique problems, let's take a look at a couple of examples. They're not all. This is not every economic example or economic motion, but it's a few. And there's a couple of them. So the ones that we have here are things like this house would introduce an inheritance tax of 100%. All of your money goes to the government. It could be something like banning unpaid internships. It could be that Greece should exit the Eurozone. Or you would force companies to keep their workers safe. It could be a minimum wage requirement for all workers. Or it could even be something much more explicitly economic-based, in that you would require multinational banks to hold large amounts of financial reserves. Now, all of these, in some ways, are either explicitly or at least have an economic component to them. That you could imagine somebody making an argument that relates to economics. Either it could be about taxation, or it could be about currency and currency mediums, if it's, say, like the Eurozone. Or it could be about what companies ought to do. Because if companies exist to be profitable, does it make any sense for them to keep their workers safe? Does it make any sense for them to, say, have minimum wage requirements? Or should governments force them to do those things? Because though they don't have an incentive to do it, they should do it. All of these are related to a very broad sector of motion and argument, in that they kind of fit under this middle of like economic or monetary types of arguments. And so, when you get something like this is really what this lecture exists to help you figure out. This is the lecture that helps you figure out, okay, how do I approach this better? How do I make sure that I don't just say something like, well, companies exist to make money, and because companies exist to make money, we should therefore not force them to keep anybody safe. Because it doesn't matter. They should be making money, and that would be difficult for them to make money. And because then when that happens, you also don't want opposition to say things like, but companies have an obligation. They have an obligation to keep their workers safe. Because again, you're not engaging on the same level. You've made the assumptions about how you would approach this debate and have not yet explained why those approaches are good or why those approaches are bad. You also haven't engaged on the other approach that the other side is making. So those are the examples of motions, or motions that could be economic based. I'll wait just a second so you can get pictures, and then I can also send these to you as well. That's also fine. Okay. So, this is where we'll start now to look at some strategic approaches. And the strategic approaches are going to be a couple. In fact, they're right there, they're listed. So that you should possess the knowledge, you should provide clarity, and you should avoid technical jargon. Which I'm probably doing a bad job of, actually, in a lot of ways, in the sense of like saying some technical jargon and all that. But possessing the knowledge is a very important strategy. You have to have a basic understanding of some economic concepts in order to do a good job in many of the debate rounds that I have just used as an example. For example, you have to have a bit of knowledge about, say, basic supply and demand. That's important. When you understand basic supply and demand, you can make the types of arguments about when goods or when items are produced. You can make an argument about why they're produced at that particular level. What happens when they're produced? What happens if supply surprisingly increases? Think about a debate about oil, for example. The oil market is something that comes up fairly regularly in debates, where you talk about the supply of oil and how it's controlled. And how sometimes, if people drive a lot less, or people use less gas, or use less oil, what ends up happening is the prices are going to decrease. Because there's still a moderately fixed supply of that oil within the market. And so, those are the types of arguments that you gain access to by basic knowledge of supply and demand. But also, the function of interest rates is fairly important. In that, what interest rates convey is that if you get a loan from a private bank and they say, well, we'll give you $20,000 to do something, and that loan is made, and the interest rate is, let's say, 5%. And this is interesting. This is a part of the lecture here that is actually about economic knowledge, because I find myself explaining these concepts. However, that seems fine because it can't hurt if all of you know this anyways, or some of you know it at least. So, but that function of interest rate, that 5%, that's going to indicate or suggest how risky that loan is. Interest rates convey risk. They say, I will give you this money, but I am taking on a risk by doing it, and so you're going to pay me back more afterwards. That's why the people who say aren't reliable and have no ability, largely have a very limited ability to pay back a loan, or banks think that they have no ability to pay back a loan, end up getting very high interest rates. But think about this as well within the context of, say, economic treasury bonds and things like reserve currencies and things like that. If the interest rate that the US government pays on their treasury bonds that they sell to other countries, that China, Japan, the UK, the American people, all of them buy quite a bit of them. And it's because they're a very safe bet. Everybody expects that the United States will be able to pay off that debt. Everybody expects that it will be paid back. And so the interest rate on treasury bonds are very, very low. In fact, they're below 1%. Because everyone acknowledges and recognizes that it will one day be paid back. That's why you don't have to panic until the market thinks that the US won't be able to pay them back, and then the interest rates would actually start to rise quite a bit. And that's what happened to Greece, and that's what happened to Portugal, and that's what happened to Italy. And that every time they tried to increase their government debt, the market was like, I don't think so. I don't think you're going to be able to pay that back, so the only way that I will buy this from you is if you give me a 7 or a 10% interest rate. And you would owe us 10% interest on, say, $5 million. And then the borrowing rates for them increased because they were no longer reliable, because no one felt okay giving them that money anymore. And so knowing about that gives you quite a bit of access to a round of something like Greece exiting the Eurozone, or whether or not the Eurozone should break up. Those types of arguments are now accessible if you know these basic functions. Theories of taxation, also very important. Something I'm not really going to explain all that much because it would take forever, and this would be a whole different elective in that event. But ultimately, the basic thing that you want to know is that some people think that a larger base of taxation and lower rates is a better way of taxing people than a smaller base with higher rates. And so it's in the sense of like, in fact, I'm going to draw this very quickly, and the camera people will be mad, but it's a matter of going like that as compared to like that. This means that more people get taxed, but at a smaller rate of taxation. This means fewer people, so people like people with very low incomes, for example, or people who are very old, don't pay. These get cut off. The people who are poor and the people who are old. And then in order to get these trials back, they have to tax them at a higher rate. They have to make it more expensive, and so your tax rates go up. Those are the two very basic ideas of taxation. There's a lot more to talk about, but any time you have a motion like this House would tax tobacco, if you think about what taxing tobacco is like, it's much more similar to this, because you're specifically taxing a small group of people for something that they use. In the same way that if I use public transportation, I pay a little bit to use it. The people who drive cars, though they pay some too, they don't pay that extra bit to use that public transportation, because I am a person who benefits specifically from that public good. And so that's another thing that you want to focus on, or that you want to probably learn more about, because these are, again, basic concepts with regards to the motions that usually come up. But also, the functions of money in banks are finally the last area that might be somewhat useful to have a little bit of knowledge about. In that, basically, money is going to be a way in which you exchange labor in a lot of ways. So I work at a job, and I get, let's say I now have $100, and I'm very excited that I have this $100, and I find somebody who handmade, like, a piece of, like, they carved something out of stone. They made a stone sculpture that I want to buy. They worked very hard at that stone sculpture. They probably spent, let's say, 3 or 4 hours making that stone sculpture. And what ended up happening is that they said, well, this stone sculpture, like the stone itself, cost $10. And my labor, the 3 hours that I put into this, cost $60. That is 60 plus that 10, $70. That's how much that costs. And then I give them that $70, and then I take the stone statue away. And what that means is that I went to work somewhere else, and I had this money, this stored labor, this stored work that I had done, that I had collected, and then I gave it to somebody else for their work, and then I took the good that they had produced. That's one of the functions of money, and there are plenty, and then banks do lots of things as well, in the sense that they will often, say, evaluate risk. That's why they give out loans. They determine who is and isn't risky, who can and cannot be trusted with other people's money. I realized that we just went through a whole bunch of economic concepts, and I had forgotten, in fact, that this slide was in here, and so that's why we were talking about it. However, what are your questions about any of these? Is there anything that you would like to hear again or hear explained differently. Yes?
About the free market and free trade.
Free market and free trade?
Yeah.
That's another very good subject area that you want to focus on. When you're talking about, when people talk about the free market, they largely are talking about markets that have very little regulation. That more or less, people come together and they buy and sell whatever it is that they want. Free trade is a little bit different in that free trade is more of an idea that there are no barriers to trade. You just, like, no one says, so for example, the US and China sometimes get into arguments about free trade. Oftentimes, they get into little trade wars as well. And it ends up meaning that, like, sometimes the US says, well, any Chinese, like any particular Chinese good, let's say it's tires, for example, any Chinese tire that comes into America is going to cost more because we're going to put a tax on it of some sort. We're going to, it's a tariff is what it's called. And that will make it more expensive so that American-made tires look equally, cost an equal amount, or maybe even cost less. And so therefore people, when they're making a decision about what they're going to buy or what they're going to sell, or really what they're going to buy, if they're going to buy tires and they see that American tires are cheaper, then they're going to buy those ones, not the Chinese-made ones, even though they were imported. And even though they would have been cheaper without that tax or without that tariff. So that's, free trade is the situation where that doesn't happen. When goods from one country get to compete with goods from another country in the free market, in a time where the government doesn't make one of them more expensive than the other one, rather than just allowing them to compete about which one's the better quality product. Because sometimes it's going to be the case that even if the car that's made in South Korea that gets imported to America is maybe of less quality than some of the cars that are made in America in and of itself. And so then people will make that choice. They will evaluate the goods on their own and decide which ones are better and which ones are worse. And what free trade does is it provides an advantage to both countries. The advantage that is provided to both countries, it's often called a comparative advantage, is that countries tend to be good at producing some things. So the US has quite a bit of open land, quite a lot of coal, quite a lot of natural gas. China has lots of labor and lots of minerals that have become very important to the development of electronics. And what that means is that if the US wants to build electronics, we have to get and we don't have any of those minerals, we have to trade with China in order to actually have them, and to actually get those minerals. And so sometimes it's the case that we'll say, okay, we'll take this amount of minerals and we'll send you this amount of natural gas or this amount of coal or something like that. And that's what ends up happening, and that's how trade works, because these two countries have things that they're better at. Like imagine, it's similar to any time that you have friends, right? You might have a friend who's a very good saxophone player. You also might have a friend who's a very good drummer player. You might have a friend who's a very good guitarist. And then you're like, okay, well, you know what? We should make a band. We should all come together and play music. Because not one of you can play all of the instruments, but all of you together can make one sound and can in fact contribute into that, into that collective. And so that's the same thing that's happening here, in that we can send energy, the US can send energy, like energy resources to China. China can send minerals to the US, and we can each do more things because of it. And so that's what ends up happening with trade. Now that's not necessarily the complex economic view of it, but that's ultimately what's happening. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay, great. So, now that, are there any other questions before we begin? Yes?
I studied in school, and it's called like the Chinese version of LSE. Everyone has economic background. And what we end up is when we are having debates inside school, everyone is using the cost-benefit analysis model to explain the notion or debate about it. And our coach is a JD, and he has no economic background, and he said when you go out and debate with people from other schools, they have no idea what you're talking about.
Yep.
And how to solve
problem is that economists, or people who have an economics background, just assume that everybody else knows what they're talking about. Because obviously, it's so clear, so simple. That's not what ends up happening. You need to, if you're going to use a cost-benefit analysis, you must justify it. That absolutely has to happen. You need to tell us why that is the way to evaluate the policy, why that is the way that is the most beneficial way. Oftentimes, it's not the most beneficial way to evaluate the policy. And so, we're going to move on. But let's be clear, actually, before we talk about this, because possessing that economic knowledge is actually important, or at least understanding those concepts is going to be important. Because it allows you to have the conversations about economics without feeling or sounding like you don't know what you're talking about. So providing clarity, this is the beginnings of the answer to your question. But the ultimate answer is at the very end, and I'll point to that when we get there. Providing clarity. This is a fairly important strategy, even in just general terms, in the sense that just because you know what you're talking about doesn't mean that anybody else does. And so oftentimes, people assume that just because you know it, or because I know it, it means that I can convey it in a way that's persuasive. But you need to really work. You need to really work on the persuasion part of this. Because ultimately, you're trying to make people understand things that aren't easily understandable or don't seem immediately clear. Like, people can tell you about a democracy fairly quickly and fairly easily, and you'll understand the concept. You'll say, well, people vote, and then there are leaders. They vote for the people that they want to run the country. That's democracy. But if I talk to you about an economic model, that's not going to be easily understandable, because there's a lot of moving parts. So I can say, well, we're going to have a free market society. And we say, well, what about trade? What about wages? What about how do companies work? Do individuals have any rights? All of those become questions that you don't necessarily have the answer to. And you don't have a way of clearly providing the information to them. And so what you want to do, in the first place, is number one, you want to have the base knowledge, of course. That's always going to be step one. But you're also going to want to explain what the other side tried to say. So when someone makes an economic argument, and it's fine, it's good, you want to then explain it again from your side when you're going to refute it. You explain their argument and then summarize the differences. You explain why that argument is different from the standard that you are talking about. What parts of that argument don't matter, or why they're not important, or even other implications of that argument. So for example, if someone comes up and says something like, well, Greece should leave the Eurozone because they're in a lot of debt. And because they're in so much debt, they will never be able to operate as a functioning government again unless they leave the Eurozone. Therefore, they'd be better off leaving the Eurozone. That could be an argument that someone makes, and then you from the other side should try to explain that again with more clarity, and explain something along the lines of, the government side thinks that Greece should leave the Eurozone because if they stay in the Eurozone, they'll never become a functioning government. And then you would talk about how that's different from the standard that you're using, because your standard could be something like European unity. And so you want to say something like, if Greece leaves the Eurozone, that breaks European unity in a way that's very negative. Even if Greece continues to have difficulties serving as a functional government over the next 4 to 5 years, or even 5 to 10 years, we still think that's better than them leaving the Eurozone and breaking off this grand European project. This European unity should be more valuable than whether or not Greece is a functioning government. That's the way that you start to make the comparisons between the economic arguments. Because ultimately, that government argument that I described, Greece leaving the Eurozone because they're not a functioning government, is a cost-benefit analysis. The cost of Greece staying in the Eurozone is them not being a functioning government, them struggling under a significant debt. And the benefit, in some ways, is going to be like that by leaving, they will be able to become functioning again. And so, because the government side is assuming that it's more beneficial for Greece to become a functional government, you're going to compare that against your standard of European unity is the most important thing within this debate. That's when it starts to happen. And I understand that's a little complex, and it's a little perhaps difficult to visualize. But the next time you're in the type of debate round that has this economic component, try and remember this particular conversation, because it'll become quite a bit clearer to you how to approach it in slightly more effective manners. Are there any questions on providing clarity? Additionally, this is a strategy that works in many debates. If it's complicated, if it's difficult to understand, then if you're clear, the judges will like you. They're going to be like, okay, that person was very clear. I understand what you said. I didn't understand what anybody else said, but what you said, I understood. That's what starts to happen. So the next strategy is to avoid technical jargon. If you know things about economics, you sometimes rely on them. You sometimes talk about like ISLN curves. You sometimes talk about the macroeconomy and why government spending, investment, and exports and imports and how that affects GDP. And you can talk about NGDP. You can talk about GNP. You see how I'm just boring you and how you have no idea what I'm actually talking about? That's what happens in a debate round. That often happens because people will just start throwing out concepts and throwing out terms and hoping that something sticks and hoping that they say something correct. I felt bad beforehand when I was saying things like theories of taxation, because that just sounds like something that doesn't even exist in real life. But it does, and it exists in the field of economics. And so that's what you want to avoid. You don't want to, if you're going to use something that is technical, like let's say even something like GDP, like gross domestic product, you're going to want to explain what that is. You're going to want to explain how that works within the debate. Because if you don't, no one's going to understand why it's important, particularly if you happen to know economics and nobody else does. So if you happen to have the economics background, you're going to feel as though you're explaining really basic things to people all the time. And that you're saying things like, well, we're talking about increasing the GDP of a country is really good. Because the GDP is an indicator of how well the society is doing overall. And so if GDP rises, we tend to think that society is now better off in tangible terms because they've now produced more goods and because people's income has probably risen. You get to say things like that, but that is much longer than just saying, well, GDP went up and we're happy about it. Because you have no reason to think that's important. None of you have any reason to think that that's important if you don't have an economic background. So that's why you have to explain what the concept is and explain why it's relevant. And you need to do that, again, for everything, right? If you're going to talk about basic supply and demand, you need to explain how it works, why it's relevant, and then what the impact of the effect that you're talking about is going to be. Are there any questions on this? This one is fairly clear and fairly easy to understand. But it is a trap that people often fall into. They will often just not explain jargon or technical concepts. Well, in that case, we're going to go on to the last part. And the last part is actually my favorite part. And the reason is because this is actually how you start to make impacts of economic arguments sound persuasive and in fact matter within the debate round. And so the question here, of course, that's written is that what effect does a tax increase have on people? Again, the step people end up, in many different cases, people end up stopping too early when they're talking about economic impacts because they assume that the next step they'll say something like, well, if the government taxes cigarettes more, then the government will have more tax revenue. And therefore, the government will be able to do more good things, and that's good. That's largely what ends up happening with economic impacts. That people just say, well, government having more money is a good thing, because they'll be able to spend on social programs. But that doesn't actually have any tangible benefit or tangible effect. Because I can just say, well, lower taxes are better because people are happier when they have their own money. And again, we're falling into the traps of both sides not engaging with each other. The parallel debate is just happening. You're not intersecting, you're not crisscrossing, none of that is happening when you're not taking this particular step. And it's a matter of having economic impacts versus value impacts. Because, again, within the field of economics, and especially the way that people conceptualize economics, even if they don't know about it, or even if they never studied it, they often think about what that means. So an impact within the field, from the academic field of economics, is something like, and we see that GDP will rise by 5% over the next 3 years. That's the conclusion that economists make. They say that's the end. That is the end part that they say. And people fall into that trap. They fall into the trap of saying that only that at the end of their argument. And that's the economic impact. Okay, well, GDP rises. But GDP rising has tangible effects on people, on society. It changes the way that companies interact. It changes people's expectations about how their life is going to go. And that's what we want to talk about. Because that's much more tangible. People understand that far better. If GDP rises by 5%, that means that people who were barely scraping by, who on a day-to-day basis were worried about money and were upset and didn't know what to do because they could barely afford food, are now able to afford food on a day-to-day basis and can plan for the future because they have enough money. That's a tangible effect. That is a value impact because you're saying it's good that people who didn't have money beforehand and now actually do have money, can now afford things that they need. That's the intangible effect of a 5% GDP increase. Or that could be. It's not necessary, but that could be the effect that we want to talk about. In the same way that people often say something like, well, if we increase the supply of goods, or the supply of any good, any particular product that people want, those goods will be cheaper. And it'll be good that those products are cheaper. That's an economic impact. The value impact is to say, if we increase the supply of goods, or if we increase the supply to make them cheaper, because they're cheaper, people will be able to afford them. And they will then have money left over that they otherwise would have spent on those goods to spend it on other things that they want to spend their money on. So if the price of housing in Beijing becomes cheaper, people then have more money to go out and buy, say, different kinds of food, different kinds of drinks, different teas, different anything. Maybe they can buy more clothing, maybe they can buy more electronics, but they otherwise couldn't have afforded because housing was so expensive. But because the cost of it went down, they can now do other things that make them happier. That's the conclusion that you want to get to. Those are the extra couple steps that you want to arrive at, because then you're making not only economic analysis, but you're also making value analysis. You're talking about what's important to people and what should be valued by society. Does that make sense to everybody, this particular thing? Because we're going to now examine a couple. Economic versus value impact. They line up just right. So, if something results in a 25% tax increase, that's the economic impact. That's the end for the economic argument. But if you're doing it correctly, if you're doing it with values, you're going to say something like, well, families, because of this tax increase, will have less money to spend on food and fun. And if that happens, if families can't go out and have a good time together, well, maybe those families won't be as strong. Maybe they'll have to work harder. And maybe that means that the children don't get to see their parents as much. That's what you can then talk about. That gives you access to a whole different set of arguments that you don't get to if you don't do the extra couple steps. Additionally, if you talk about something like Greece exiting the Eurozone, and then the euro stabilizes. So right now, the euro, it's pretty unstable. People are unsure what's going to happen with it. So if Greece exits, then the euro becomes stable. Good. Stable Eurozone. Excellent. But maybe now it's the case that businesses from around the world are happier knowing that the euro is safe to invest in, which means that in Europe, more people are willing to spend money there. More companies and businesses are willing to enter into that market because they're not afraid of the currency suddenly disappearing and having to adapt to that. And so now maybe businesses from around the world can go ahead and enter into that market, which then means that consumers have more choices about what they want to buy and what they don't want to buy. And now they have more, if they have more choice, that makes those markets more competitive. And a more competitive economic market is going to be one that's going to force the price of those goods down. And if those goods are cheaper, we already saw what happens when goods are cheaper. If goods are cheaper, people can buy less or more of them if they want to. That's where you get to if you talk about it in these value terms. And then finally, of course, we get an environmental one. That by ignoring environmental costs, we can produce things very cheaply. And we produce things cheaply. Cheap goods, those are the good ones. We want them to be cheap. But poor people who can't afford nearly anything, have a higher quality of life when goods are cheap. They have a higher quality of life in the sense that they can afford things that they need to purchase when we ignore environmental costs. Because environmental costs, if they were taken into account, would make goods much more expensive. And because those goods would be more expensive, there are quite a few people in the world who would not be able to purchase them. Or quite a few people in a particular country who would not be able to purchase them. And because they wouldn't be able to, they would have their life would be less good. It would be much more difficult. It would be far harder for them to purchase the food that they need, or get the housing that they need, or anything like that. Now that you all see this, now that you see the comparison between the economic impact versus the value impact, and how you get there, do you have any questions about the steps that you need to take to do that? Is there anything that you're concerned about with regards to making that jump? Because it's just a matter of thinking about why such an impact matters to people. So oftentimes, in many debates, what I've seen so far are people saying things like, well, the government taxes people. And since the government taxes people, that means that it's representative of what all people want. And so if not all people want this, then we shouldn't do that policy. So for example, like if the government's going to spend money on like culture. The government is going to spend money on culture and like making that taxation argument, that's not where you want to be at. You don't want to be saying that just because the government taxes people, they therefore get to, or they therefore can't do certain things. You instead want to be talking about why contributing money to a society means that you should have some representation within that society. That's perhaps a better way of going about it. And if you feel as though you're taxing, the taxes that you give to the government don't actually represent what you want, or what you feel, or what you think is important, then what does that do? Maybe that means you don't like the government as much as you could. Maybe that means that you think the government should change. And if you think that the government should change, then what does that do? How does that impact the relationship between the people who don't feel represented by the government and the people who are running the government and stuff? Does that cause tension? It probably does cause tension. And that's a much better way of attacking that taxation argument than just saying, well, everyone contributes money, therefore it's okay to do this, or therefore it's not okay to do this. What are your questions? Is anybody ridiculously confused by everything that just happened? That's good. It looks like doesn't look like any of you are ridiculously confused. So that's good. I imagine that it's going to be good. It's now 2:55, and so we are finished, in fact. We're going to now get ready for the debate, and we're going to start on time, which is going to be lovely, which means we'll get out right at 5 o'clock, and now no one's going to be upset. Thank you all. This is very fun. This is good. If you have any questions, please ask.
他就是说把所有的那个 impact 变成